One of the biggest gaps with my C3 Corvette is it doesn't have an overdrive gear, and because of that, I often found myself avoiding the highways. Now if you ask me, that greatly impacts the fun factor your car has, and it was about time I fixed this, and that's when I reached out to the guys at Silver Sport Transmissions to help me out. What Silver Sport does is they modify modern Tremec transmissions with an overdrive to fit in your old school hot rod. I did my research and I picked a PerfectFit kit because some of the engineers at Silver Sport are the same engineers who designed Tremec transmissions in the first place. Because of this, these guys are going to know better than anyone the best way to retrofit a modern transmission into your hot rod. From my evaluation, there's really three things that make a PerfectFit kit a perfect fit for your car. And the first is transmission modifications to the shifter and the housing, the second is custom brackets designed and made by SST, and the third is the drive shaft. Before we start the installation, let's take a closer look at the modified transmission from SST. My C3 Corvette shipped from the factory with a Borg-Warner ST10 installed, and I'm replacing it with the TKO 600. Both the clutch spline count and the input shaft on these two transmissions is identical, so the new transmission is going to bolt up to the bell housing no problem. Where most modifications have been made to the new transmission is the tail shaft housing, and that's machining to make sure the transmission clears the cross member and the transmission tunnel. And secondly is the shifter, and that's getting the shifter into the right location while making sure it still shifts crisp and accurate. While it's entirely possible to install an SST kit with the engine still in the car, you'll have an easier time dialing things in with the engine out, and since I'm building a new engine to go with the transmission, I'm going to install these two as a package deal. The first component to install is a pilot bearing, and I highly recommend you stick with the pilot bearing and not use a bushing. Some guys like to use bushings because they have a little more slop and they can't grenade and take out your input shaft. While there might be a perceived benefit there, the TKO uses tapered roller bearings on the input shaft, while your older transmission probably uses ball bearings which could tolerate more slop. That's why you need a pilot bearing to more accurately locate the input shaft, otherwise you might have trouble shifting or you could even shorten the transmission life. To demonstrate how well a pilot bearing holds location, I machined a scrap piece of aluminum within a tenth of nominal, and as you can see, it's a very snug fit. The next component I'm installing is a new flywheel, and I'm using some thread lock on the fasteners and I did a quick flatness check, but I had to get the flywheel in place for the most important verification of the whole transmission install, and that's aligning the bell housing to the engine. The pilot bearing we just talked about is located on the center line of the crankshaft, and the main purpose of the bell housing is to perfectly align the transmission to that center line. Using a magnetic dial indicator attached to the flywheel, I'm able to show that my bell housing is out 15 to 16 thou at its max point. That meant I needed to move the bell housing down 7 to 8 thousandths to bring the transmission into alignment, and I did this by machining some offset dowels on my lathe. I made the offset by simply inserting a 7th thou feeler gauge leaf into one of the jaws of the chuck, and then when I was done machining it, I checked it with an indicator. With the new dowels installed, the total indicated runout of my bell housing is now 4 thousandths, or the center lines of the transmission and engine are out 2 thou, and that's within the tolerance that Tremec recommends for their transmissions. To further illustrate the point, remember the test part I made earlier for the pilot bearing and how snug that fit? Well, if you don't take the time to align your bell housing to the engine, you're going to be forcing the input shaft into this bearing, and that's when all kinds of bad things can happen. Alright, moving right along, I'm installing a pretty standard aftermarket clutch kit, and I also need to get the clutch fork installed into the bell housing, so let's catch up in a bit. As you can see, I was not able to fully seat the transmission onto the bell housing, and this is because the clutch is slightly out of alignment. The fix for this is pretty easy, and it's just to take pressure off the clutch disc so it can move slightly while the transmission seats. After I torque these last couple bolts, it's time to install this thing in the car. The engine and transmission installation went really well, and I had no problem getting the assembly in the car. I used a standard 2-ton engine hoist with a leveler, and I was a little concerned about getting over the radiator core support, but in the end it wasn't a problem. Now regarding clearances of the massaged SST transmission housing, things look really good. It clears the tunnel just fine, the yoke isn't too close to the sides, it clears the e-brake, the shifter is in exactly the right spot. It's very clear that SST did their homework when they put this kit together, and it fits really well in my C3 Corvette. Okay, moving along. So I raised the car up so I can reinstall the shifter and also install the transmission mounting bracket. The SST instruction manual tells you to take the shifter off when you're installing the transmission, but I have a sneaky suspicion I could have probably gotten this thing in there with it in place. It's worth noting though that the Tremec transmission is definitely larger than OEM, and in my situation I might have just been blessed with some good body mounts and a little extra space. It's always good to play it safe though, and that's why I removed the shifter for install. Next up is a custom transmission mounting bracket, which is both a little shorter in length and height to accommodate the Tremec transmission. This is a well designed and well built bracket, and I think it probably gets pinion angled pretty close to where it needs to be, but unfortunately I can't check that until the car is back on the ground. The next bracket supplied in the kit likely only applies to C3 Corvette owners who want to run the exhaust under the car. Because the new transmission is longer, the existing OEM bracket isn't going to work because it'll hit the cross member, and in its place, SST provides a shorter bracket. The downside to this bracket is the ends aren't formed, so if you use C-clamps to hold the pipes up, they might not seal and you'll have an exhaust leak. Rather than risk this, I chose to modify the existing OEM bracket that's formed with an angle grinder and a drill press, and the end product, it looks like it fits pretty well and I think it's going to work just fine. Driveshaft installation went well with one caveat. When I removed the shipping plug, it was clear it had been shoved in there pretty hard and it deformed the yoke seal, and I am a little concerned about that leaking. I think Tremec probably installed this one at the factory, and I'm going to keep an eye on it going forward. I'm not sure how much play you're supposed to have at the transmission yoke, but with this drive shaft it's right around 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch. And when you mate that to a rigid mounted differential, it seems to me it's in the right ballpark. I also noticed a slight angling up towards the differential, but again, I can't check pinion angle until this thing's back on the ground. Barring installation of some of the finishing pieces like the shifter handle or the fascia plate, installation of the transmission is complete. I'd like to show you installation and fit of some of these items, but the interior of my car is a complete disaster. I'm replacing all the old ratty wiring, and I'm also rebuilding the pedal box so I have a nice smooth clutch pedal to mate to my new transmission. Rest assured though, I'm going to have this thing back on the road soon, and when I do, I'll follow up with a video on how well it drives and all the finishing touches too. I'm very happy I went with an SST kit over trying to piece together a conversion myself, and that's because the fit is great, the quality is great, the completeness of the kit is excellent. I mean, you get everything you need. And I'm really excited to see how this thing works out long term in my C3. Why don't you leave me a comment, let me know what you think, and thanks for watching.